My name is Peter Raymer. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk about how to create a form in Microsoft Dynamics 365 F&O. In a previous article, we looked at how to create a table, because usually the first thing you need if you're going to create a form is a table that you can write to and read to. So last time we created a table called car, where we could store our car information. In this video, we're going to create a form called car where you can read and write to that table's information. There are many different types of forms in D365. I'm going to cover a really basic form to get you started, and maybe in a future video we can go into some of the more detailed forms. All right, let's get started. So this is the form that we're ultimately trying to create, is a form that has car ID and description in a grid, and we have got a quick filter, and we'll be able to have an add and delete buttons at the top. So to get you started, we can create a new solution. Since this is kind of a more beginner tutorial, I wanted to show that as well. I can click File, New, and then say Project, and then I can specify the D365 project type, right here, and then I'm going to select Finance and Operations. I've actually already got a project going called Tutorial Car, so I'll leave this alone. But you can go ahead and type in the name of your project and your solution name. You can leave this checkbox checked, create a directory for a solution. That's nice to have. And then if you've got source control set up, you can also say add to source control. If you do not, you can leave that unchecked. So I'll go ahead and hit cancel in this case. The next thing that you want to make sure that you've done, especially if you're creating a table, is you want to right click on your project and select Properties, and make sure that Synchronize Database on Build is set to True. If you've already created your table, this is not necessary, but this makes sure that if you do create a table, the changes, the new fields that you add, the table itself gets synchronized to the SQL database. You'll also want to make sure that you specify your model to make sure it's in your custom model and not one of the existing base Microsoft models. All right, I'll hit cancel on this. So again, we're looking to create this form here. I'll go ahead and create a new form just so we can start from scratch. So if you right click on your project and select Add, then New Item, it's going to bring up this New Item dialog where you can pick from all the different types of objects in D365. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the Form object, and I'll go ahead and call this tut for tutorial car, and then maybe I'll call it the word two, just since this is the second time that I'm doing it and I already have tut car. I'll go ahead and click add. You can just call it tut car if you want. The system's going to go ahead and create us a new car object and open the form designer for us. The form designer is pretty cool. It's split up into a few different windows. On the left hand side we can see our methods and our data source is, and on the right side we see the designer where we can add all our different nodes that make up our form. In this bottom window here we've got a preview pane as well as a pattern pane that we'll get to in just a minute. Okay, usually the very first thing you want to do, depending on what your form is you want to add a data source. You can do this second as well, but let's go ahead and start with this. So once I've added, basically to add a data source is a form or a view that contains my data that I would like to modify or add to, insert into. So I'm going to go ahead and search for car in the Application Explorer and find the table named car that I had created before. If you've got a different table that you'd like to add as your data source, which is most likely the case, you can browse for that as well. If you're not seeing the Application Explorer, you can go up to the View menu and click the drop down and select Application Explorer. This is our main tree for finding all the data we're interested in the system. So after it searches for a second, you can collapse data types, expand tables, and find this car object here. The next thing that we can do is we can drag this car table over to the data sources node. This is the easiest way that we can add a data source to a form. You alternately could right-click on this data sources node and select New Data Source and add a new data source that way, and then select the properties on that node and set the table property to the table you'd like to pick, and you can rename the data source to the name of the table, just following best practices. But by us dragging the table either from our solution or from the AOT itself over to this data sources node, it just sets these two properties for us, which is nice and makes it a little faster. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is this design node. This is where it gets into a much bigger conversation that I could talk about for a long time. But in D365, forms can be set with a design pattern. What that is we, well, I'll show you here in a second, but we tell Visual Studio in this form what design pattern we're about to use. That allows Visual Studio to give us feedback and kind of walk us through as a guide on what nodes are required for this design pattern. Design patterns are predefined patterns that Microsoft has set up, and they allow, the purpose of them is so that all forms within the system follow a certain look and feel that's consistent. That is really great because then end users can look at these forms, and when they see forms that follow one of these patterns, if they have experience using a form in the past that also uses that same pattern, that increases the time that they can, or really, I should say, it reduces the time it takes them to get up to speed with your form. They already understand maybe where the buttons are, where the grids are. They can expect to know where the filters are. By having a consistent place for each type of node, it helps them use the form that much quicker. So it's a really great thing. It also allows certain things to be defaulted in as we're developing this form. So I'll go ahead and right click on this design pattern. I get an option to select Apply Pattern. Under Apply Pattern, I can see that there is a lot of different design patterns that I can make use of depending on how I want my form to look and what controls I expect to use. In this case, we're going to start with a very simple form. Again, this is forms are very complex, and there could be a lot of instruction on this. I'm starting on some very basic. So if we select Simple List, that is the design pattern used for a form with just basic grids. Usually one of the first things you need to do is decide which design pattern should I use, and that's where I've included a link in this article, but you can come over to this link of Microsoft's, and this provides instruction on what design patterns should be used and kind of give you a look and feel of the forms for each design pattern. So you can see here's a bunch of them, and if we click over on this Simple List form, this shows us what a simple list form pattern should look like. It should have a basic grid, a filter, and then buttons in this action pane at the top. And that's exactly what we're going for, so that's why I chose the simple list form pattern. Usually it takes a while or looking at these different documents to understand which form pattern you're going for. Okay, we come back over here. I've selected the simple list pattern. All of a sudden Visual Studio has helped us out, and they have switched to this pattern tab, and we can now see kind of guided instruction as to what nodes we need in order to meet the requirements of this design pattern. And again, the whole purpose of this design pattern is to be consistent across the whole system. The D365 system has thousands of forms, and so we want to make sure that all those forms are easy for the users to understand. So okay, let's start with this first one, this action bar, action pane. This bar is essentially the thin bar at the top that allows you to have buttons. It can also be a full-blown ribbon bar, as you might see in other Microsoft Office 365 applications. So in this case, let's go ahead and add an application bar. I can do that by right-clicking on the design node, and then once that context menu comes up, I can select New Action Pane. And select Action Pane. Now that we've done that, if you actually select back on the design node, you can see that the pattern has adjusted, and now this node is no longer red, indicating we actually have an action pane. Action panes you would typically add button groups to, or other types of, an additional action pane tabs. In this case, we don't actually need to add a button group. D365 is going to help us out and kind of give us those save, new, and delete buttons for us kind of automatically. One thing I like to do though is rename this control to not have the 1 as a suffix. I believe Visual Studio is doing that to try to make sure that we have unique node names across the whole system, but I like to kind of clean that up and remove that 1. Okay, we've got the action bar, action pane, and then we need 2 more nodes. I'm actually going to create the simple list grid first, or otherwise known as a grid, because our group will actually reference our grid. So let's add our grid. I'll select New, and it's actually, we scroll down, select Grid. Now, since we've used a field group on the table that is on our data source here, we can do something really cool. First, I'll remove the 1 from the name, and I'll set our data source to be the data source we've added to our form, car, and then I can select the data group. This actually shows me all of the field groups that are on the underlying table for this data source. So this data source car points to the table named car, and that table has field groups for auto lookup, auto report, and I created the one called identification. In general, you'd always want to point to one, I'd say, that you've created. That way you kind of have full control. So I called it identification, and inside of that I actually copied in both the fields on this table, the car ID and the description. And when I do that, simply by me setting the data group, it has automatically added those 2 controls to this grid. This is really powerful. It's really useful. This way in the future, if I need to add additional fields to this grid, all I need to actually do is add the field to the table and drag it into the field group. It gives me a lot of control over the form without needing to modify the form directly. If I don't have a field group, I don't have to set the data group. I could come to this data source here, expand it, expand the fields, and actually drag the fields across into this form grid control, and it would add my controls as well. All right, if I select this top design node again, we'll see that now I've got 2 out of the 3 set up. I've got my grid and my application bar that are no longer red. The last thing I need is, it looks like it's a group. You can see between the parentheses, that's the type of control we need to add. So I'll go ahead and add the group. I'll select new and then group. The next thing I need to do is, the group's actually in the wrong order for it to be noticed by this form pattern. So I need to move the group above the grid. The way I do that is I hold down my control key and I push the up arrow. I can use the up and down arrows in the control key to move that group anywhere I need to, and I can do that with other controls on the form designer. In this case, I'll have it in the middle, and now when I click back at this, it does recognize this group. But we're not really done quite yet with this group. First, I'll get rid of the 1 on the suffix just to make it a little cleaner. But you can see here, this group can actually take its own design pattern as well. This is kind of a sub design pattern. So if I right click on this pattern, I'll get a new option to select an additional pattern just for this group. I'll click apply pattern, and then custom and quick filters is actually my only option. Once I select that, I actually get a whole new pattern under this node, and it's showing me that I actually need a quick filter control and that's missing. So I'll go ahead and right click on this group and add that quick filter control. I'll select new and then scroll down to Q, where I can select quick filter. All right, again, I'll get rid of the 1 at the end of the name. That just cleans things up. On this quick filter control, what this actually does is it filters the grid. It provides a field for users to type in and filter the results that show in the grid. This is really fantastic. Normally you can right click on each column in a grid and apply a filter as well, but this can take a few more clicks and a few more steps to add filters to a particular column. So this quick filter allows users to type in some text, such as a unique identifier, and then using a second context menu, select which column in the grid they wish to filter on, and then the system will filter the grid on that data result. It just makes filtering that much quicker. There's a couple properties we need to now set. There's this target control. And in this target control, we're going to select our grid. That's why we created the grid first, is so that we can then select this second. The other property that's optional, but I'll direct your attention to, is there is this default column. Typically, the system's going to pick the very first column on the grid as the one that it's going to filter if the user just types some text and hits enter immediately. But if you didn't want that to be the case, this would allow you to pick a different default column. So in this case, I'll go ahead and pick car ID, even though by default it should be picking the car ID. All right, that's it. Now if I select the design, I can see that we've now met all the requirements of this design pattern. If I go over to the preview pane, I can see in general a rough preview of what this form is going to look like. I can see my quick filter and my grid with my 2 columns. There's a few other properties that I wanted to draw your attention to. There's a lot of properties on forms that are used in a lot of different cases, but there's a few that are pretty common for you to look at on every single form. If I make the properties window taller, we can see all of the properties on this design node. First thing is the caption property. This is going to control the caption of the form. Normally we would use a label file, but in this case I'll just type in the raw text here. I'll go ahead and call it car. I can also see there's this show delete button and show new button. Those will kind of show up automatically based on kind of the settings on our data source, and show whether they're enabled or disabled. But if they don't make sense for your form, such as maybe you have a read-only form, you can set those to not show. Another thing to do is set the data source. This should be set to the primary data source on your form, as well as set the title data source. The title data source is gonna control what field data is shown on your caption. It's really looking at this data source's underlying table, and on the table there's two properties, title field 1 and title field 2. Those are the field data that's going to show on the caption. This data source here is also going to be used to control your save, new, and delete buttons. It will control what data source you're interacting with when you click those buttons. Okay, we've set the main ones here. The other ones that I wanted to show you is if you click on your primary data source, there's a few properties that are really useful. There's allow create, allow delete, allow edit. These are really useful if you, again, want your form to just be a read-only form. You could set those to no. There's also the insert at end and insert if empty properties. Sometimes by default, the system will create a new row in the grid if it doesn't already have one, if this is the first one that you're doing. This is really useful and helps kind of speed up users' ability to enter the data, but if that doesn't kind of fit your design or pattern, you can set that to no. Similarly, this insert at end controls whether that new record shows at the very top of the grid of forms or at the very bottom. So those are a few useful properties to look at. Again, there's a whole lot of really useful properties on the form, but I wanted to point your attention to those. All right, lastly, how do we actually run this form? The way we run a form is we've got our solution in Visual Studio. If I right-click on this form and I say set as startup object, it's actually going to make the object bold, and that indicates to Visual Studio that which object I should start when I click this start button. So I can then build my form if I want to, say build solution, or I can go and click my start button and it will go ahead and build the solution for me, and then open a browser, direct that browser to the D365 URL and this form, and open up the form. The other thing that it'll do is it will actually attach Visual Studio to the D365 process, which is really great because if I have any methods in this form and breakpoints in that form, I can actually debug this form at the same time. And then that's it. Realistically, there's a few more things that we need for a form. We need to add a menu item that points to this form and a menu that includes that menu item. Then finally this form will show up on the very front screen. But I think I'll save that for a separate tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.